He froze in his tracks. From somewhere deep in the woods came the sound of crying, not human, but a dog. Each whimper pulled him closer, until he realized this was no ordinary encounter. Watch to the end, because what he uncovered that day didn't just save a life, it changed his own forever. Before I show you what he found, tell me, what would you do if you heard a dog crying alone in the woods? Frank Morrison wasn't the type of man who went looking for trouble. Never had been. At 62, with calloused hands that told the story of 4 decades working this same 200-acre spread of Tennessee farmland, Frank had learned that life hurt less when you kept your head down and your business to yourself. Speaking only when necessary had become an art form. A nod to the mailman. Mourning to the neighbor who lived a half-mile down the road. Nothing more. Nothing that might invite questions about how he was doing, or worse, how he was coping. Because the truth was, Frank Morrison was barely coping at all. 3 years. 3 years since Sarah's heart had simply stopped. One moment she was laughing at something on the evening news, the next she was gone. The doctors called it a massive coronary event. Frank called it the end of everything that mattered. These morning rounds had become his salvation and his prison all at once. His meditation, yes, but also his penance. A ritual of checking fence lines, feeding livestock, and maintaining a property that felt too big, too quiet, too empty without Sarah's voice calling him in for coffee. His only companion now was the sound of his own footsteps. The crunch of gravel under worn work boots. The squeak of gate hinges that needed oil but somehow never got it. The rhythmic thud of his walking stick against fence posts as he made his way around the property's perimeter. But this morning was different. The crying was getting weaker, more desperate. Each passing second felt like a weight pressing down on Frank's chest, because somewhere out there in those woods, something was suffering. Something was calling for help that might never come. And Frank Morrison knew exactly what that felt like. His first instinct was to ignore it. Turn around. Walk back to the house. Make his coffee. Pretend he'd never heard anything at all. Frank had learned the hard way that getting involved usually meant getting hurt. That caring about anything beyond these fence lines was a luxury he could no longer afford. But wait. There it was again. That sound. Frank's weathered hands tightened around his walking stick until his knuckles went white. Because something about that crying, that desperate whimpering echoing through the morning mist, reminded him of a day he'd spent 3 years trying to forget. The day Sarah's old dog Max had been hit by a car. Max had been 15 years old, nearly blind, and had wandered too close to the county road despite the invisible fence. Frank had found him in the ditch, broken but alive, making that same sound. That same helpless whimpering. The same desperate plea for someone, anyone, to care enough to help. Sarah had cried harder over Max than Frank had ever seen her cry over anything. They'd rushed him to the emergency vet, spent $1,200 they couldn't spare, and brought him home wrapped in blankets to spend his final week being hand-fed and loved. Every living thing deserves to be held when it's scared, Sarah had whispered, stroking Max's graying muzzle as he drifted off for the last time. Frank shook his head, trying to push the memory away. But the crying from the woods grew louder, more insistent, and he realized something that made his stomach clench with dread. It was getting weaker because whatever was out there was giving up hope. Frank dropped his walking stick. Let it clatter against the fence post as he turned toward the tree line. His morning checklist forgotten. His careful routine abandoned. He told himself he was just going to take a quick look. Just see what was making the noise. Maybe scare it away so he could get back to his orderly, quiet, predictable life. He had absolutely no idea he was about to make the most important decision of his life. The woods seemed darker as he approached. Thicker. The morning fog clung to the trees like smoke, and Frank found himself stepping carefully around roots and fallen branches he'd never noticed before. How long had it been since he'd walked these woods? Since before Sarah died, certainly. She used to love their evening walks back here, pointing out wildflowers and bird nests and, focus, Frank. Just find whatever's making the noise and deal with it. But as he pushed deeper into the undergrowth, branches catching at his work shirt and spider webs clinging to his face. The crying grew not just louder but more heartbreaking. More human, somehow. More like the sound Sarah had made in those final moments when she'd clutched his hand and tried to tell him something important that he'd never quite understood. Frank's heart began to hammer against his ribs. What if this wasn't just some injured raccoon or lost farm cat? What if this was something bigger? Something that would require more of him than he had left to give? But then he heard something else that made him freeze mid-step. Silence. The crying had stopped. For a moment, Frank felt a guilty wash of relief. Maybe whatever it was had moved on. Maybe he could turn around, go back to his fence line, finish his rounds, and pretend this morning had been like every other morning for the past 3 years. But then, cutting through the silence like a knife, came a sound that grabbed Frank Morrison by the throat and refused to let go. A single, weak bark. Barely audible. The sound of something that had used its last bit of strength to call out one more time. One final plea for help before giving up entirely. Frank was running before he realized he'd moved. Crashing through the underbrush, following that fading echo, his 62-year-old legs carrying him faster than they had in years. Because suddenly, inexplicably, finding whatever was making that sound had become the most important thing in the world. He was about to discover that finding the source would be the easy part. Understanding what he was looking at, that would change everything. Not just for whatever was trapped out there in the darkness, but for Frank Morrison himself. The man who'd spent 3 years learning how to stop caring was about to remember what it felt like to have something worth saving. And he was about to learn that sometimes, the thing you save ends up saving you right back. 20 yards into the woods, Frank Morrison stopped dead in his tracks. His chest was heaving from the sprint through the underbrush, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. But it wasn't exhaustion that froze him in place. It was the sound. The crying was definitely a dog. No question about that now. But it was coming from somewhere wrong. Not from ground level where an injured animal would be lying. Not from up in the trees where something might be trapped in branches. It was coming from somewhere in between. Somewhere that made absolutely no sense. Frank's weathered hands pushed aside a curtain of thick brush, thorns catching at his work shirt as he stepped into a small clearing he'd never seen before. Moss-covered stones suggested this had once been a homestead, maybe a century ago. But that wasn't what made Frank's breath catch in his throat. His eyes swept the clearing desperately, following the sound that seemed to echo from everywhere and nowhere at once. The crying was louder here, more desperate, but also somehow muffled, like it was coming through water or earth. That's when Frank noticed the rope. Old, frayed climbing rope, the kind used by rock climbers or construction workers, hanging from a massive oak tree about 15 feet up. The rope disappeared down into what Frank had initially thought was just a shadow between the ancient stones. But dangling from the end of that rope, swaying slightly in the morning breeze, was something that made Frank's stomach clench with dread. A makeshift harness. Crude but functional. The kind of thing someone would use to lower a heavy load, or raise it back up. Frank's heart began to hammer against his ribs as the horrifying truth dawned on him. He wasn't looking at a shadow between the stones. He was looking at an opening. A shaft that dropped down into darkness. Someone had lowered a dog down into what appeared to be an old, forgotten well. But why? And more importantly, how long had it been down there? Frank approached the opening on unsteady legs, his boots crunching on decades of fallen leaves. The crying grew more frantic as the dog sensed his presence above, and Frank felt something crack inside his chest at the sound of renewed hope in those desperate whimpers. He knelt at the edge of the shaft, his hands gripping the moss-covered stones that formed its rim. The smell hit him first, stagnant water, decay, and something else. Fear. The unmistakable scent of an animal that had been terrified for far too long. Frank peered down into the darkness and felt his stomach drop. 20 feet below, barely visible in the murky light that filtered down through the opening, was the outline of a large dog. German Shepherd, maybe, or a mixed breed of similar size. The animal was alive. Frank could see its sides rising and falling with labored breathing, but it was barely moving. barely holding on. "Oh, God," Frank whispered, his voice cracking. "What did they do to you?" The dog's head lifted at the sound of Frank's voice, and even from 20 feet away, Frank could see the glint of eyes looking up at him. Trusting. Hopeful. Believing that finally, someone had come to help. But as Frank studied the rope system more carefully, a cold realization settled in his gut like a stone. This wasn't an accident. The rope system was too elaborate. Too intentional. Someone had carefully rigged this pulley system, probably using the oak's massive branch as an anchor point. They'd fashioned a harness. They'd planned this. Someone had deliberately trapped this animal down here. But the rope was old. Weathered by months, maybe years of Tennessee weather. The harness showed signs of wear and rot. Frank felt bile rise in his throat as he realized what that meant. This dog could have been down there for days. Maybe weeks. Maybe longer. "I'm here, boy," Frank called down softly, surprised by the gentleness in his own voice. It had been so long since he'd spoken to anything living with kindness. "I'm going to get you out of there." The dog's crying turned into weak barks of hope, and Frank felt tears he hadn't shed since Sarah's funeral burning at the corners of his eyes. That's when he noticed something that made his hands shake with a rage he hadn't felt in years. Around the dog's neck, barely visible in the dim light, was a collar. Not the kind of cheap collar you'd put on a stray or a farm dog. This looked substantial. Well made. The kind of collar that meant this animal mattered to someone. This wasn't a stray that had wandered onto someone's property. This wasn't some feral dog that had been deemed a nuisance. This was someone's pet. Someone's companion. Someone's family. And someone else had stolen it, lowered it into this forgotten well, and left it to die. Frank's vision blurred with fury as he gripped the edge of the well so hard his knuckles went white. Who could do something like this? What kind of monster could look into a trusting dog's eyes and then condemn it to this slow, terrifying death? But even as rage coursed through his veins, Frank felt something else stirring. Something he hadn't experienced in 3 years of numb, mechanical existence. Purpose. He wasn't just looking at a trapped animal anymore. He was looking at a test. A moment that would define not just what kind of man Frank Morrison was, but what kind of man he still had the chance to become. The smart thing would be to call someone. Animal control. The sheriff. Someone younger, stronger, better equipped to handle a rescue like this. But Frank looked at that rope, weathered and rotting, and realized something that made his heart race with panic. There might not be time. The dog had stopped barking and was whimpering again, weaker now than before. Every minute Frank delayed could be the minute that hope finally died down there in the darkness. As Frank stared down into that black pit, he faced a choice that would define him for whatever years he had left. He was alone in these woods. The dog was heavy, probably 80, 90 pounds at least. And Frank Morrison was no longer a young man. His back ached on good days. His hands weren't as steady as they used to be. One wrong move, one miscalculation, and there could be 2 bodies at the bottom of that well instead of 1. But as Frank looked into those trusting eyes 20 feet below, he knew he'd already made his choice. Had made it the moment he'd heard that first desperate cry echoing through the morning mist. What he couldn't see yet, couldn't possibly understand as he began formulating a plan to descend into that darkness, was that saving this dog would end up saving him too. That the rope he was about to trust with both their lives would become the lifeline that pulled Frank Morrison back from the edge of his own deep, dark well. The well of grief and isolation he'd been trapped in for 3 long years. Frank Morrison had always been a practical man. Sarah used to tease him about it. "Frank," she'd say, "you could organize a hurricane if someone gave you enough rope and a clipboard." Well, he didn't have a clipboard. But he had rope. Frank moved with purpose now, his 62-year-old legs carrying him back through the woods faster than they had in years. The crying from the well followed him like a ghost, growing fainter with distance but never truly leaving his ears. Never letting him forget what was waiting for him in that dark pit. At his truck, Frank's hands moved with the muscle memory of 4 decades of farm work. Extra rope from the toolbox. His old leather work gloves. A flashlight that had seen better days but still threw a decent beam. And from behind the seat, something he hadn't touched since Sarah died. Her emergency first aid kit, still wrapped in the plastic container she'd insisted on keeping there. "You never know when someone might need help," she'd said. Frank's throat tightened. If only she could see him now. Back at the well, Frank studied the existing rope system with the calculating eye of a man who'd spent his life rigging farm equipment and jury-rigging solutions to problems that couldn't wait for professionals. The setup was crude but functional. Whoever had done this knew enough about leverage and anchor points to make it work. But they'd used it for evil. Frank was going to use it for good. He tested the oak branch, bouncing his full weight against the rope until he was satisfied it would hold. Then he rigged his own pulley system, using the same anchor point but with fresh rope, proper knots, and a makeshift seat he could control from inside the well. If someone had put this dog down there on purpose, Frank Morrison was going to bring it back up the same way. But he was going to do it right. The descent took forever and no time at all. Frank's hands, steady despite everything, guided him down into the darkness while his mind raced with questions he wasn't sure he wanted answered. How long had this animal been down here? How had it survived? And why, dear God, why had someone done this? The smell hit him harder as he descended. Stagnant water, yes, but also something else. Something that spoke of fear and desperation and suffering that had gone on far too long. Frank's flashlight beam danced across stone walls that wept with moisture, illuminating a space that felt more like a tomb than a well. But when Frank's feet finally touched bottom, when he turned his flashlight toward the source of those heartbreaking cries, what he found wasn't just a trapped dog. It was a German shepherd. Young, probably about 2 years old, with the kind of intelligent brown eyes that seemed to look right through you. The animal was sitting perfectly still despite its obvious weakness, and there was something about its posture, its alertness despite everything it had endured, that told Frank this was no ordinary pet. This dog had training, discipline, purpose, and around its neck wasn't just any collar. Frank's hands trembled as he moved closer, his flashlight beam catching the glint of metal tags and specialized hardware that made his breath catch in his throat. It was a military service dog collar. Heavy-duty nylon and steel, designed for working animals who went into harm's way alongside their handlers. This wasn't someone's backyard companion or family pet. This was a veteran's companion. Someone's lifeline. Someone's brother. "Oh, Jesus," Frank whispered, his voice cracking in the confined space. "What have they done to you?" The dog's tail gave the faintest wag at the sound of Frank's voice, and Frank felt something shatter inside his chest. This animal, after everything it had been through, still had hope. Still believed that people could be good. Frank's hand shook as he reached for the dog tags, his flashlight beam revealing details that made his stomach clench with rage and heartbreak. Rex, property of U.S. Army. If found, please return to. The address was smudged, damaged by moisture and time, but Frank could make out enough. A county road number he recognized. A zip code that told him everything he needed to know. This dog lived just 2 miles away. Which meant someone had taken Rex from his home, from his handler, from the person who needed him most, and had condemned him to die in this forgotten hole in the ground. But as Frank gently examined the dog, checking for injuries while murmuring reassurances, he noticed something that made his vision blur with fury. Rex wasn't just weak from hunger and thirst. His back legs showed signs of recent injury, old wounds that had healed poorly, scar tissue that suggested trauma. Someone had been disposing of a disabled service dog. A dog who'd probably been injured in the line of duty, who'd served his country and his handler with courage and loyalty, only to be discarded like garbage when he was no longer perfect. In that moment, something cracked open inside Frank Morrison's chest. Something that had been locked away and buried for 3 years. For 3 years, he'd been angry at the world. Angry at God. Angry at anyone who still had what he'd lost. He'd wrapped himself in bitterness and isolation, convinced that the universe was nothing but random cruelty and senseless loss. But holding this broken, abandoned dog in his arms, Frank realized something that knocked the breath out of him. He wasn't the only one who'd been thrown away and forgotten. Rex looked up at Frank with eyes that held no accusation, no bitterness despite everything he'd endured. Just trust. Just hope. Just the simple faith that this human, like all humans should be, was here to help. Frank's tears fell freely now, dropping onto Rex's matted fur as he gathered the dog into his arms. The animal was heavier than he'd expected, probably 90 pounds despite his weakened state, but Frank held him like he was made of spun glass. "I've got you, boy," Frank whispered into Rex's ear, his voice thick with emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. "I've got you, and I'm never going to let anyone hurt you again." Rex's response was a soft whimper, and Frank felt something he'd forgotten existed stirring in his chest. Not just purpose, but righteous fury. The kind of anger that didn't destroy, it built. It protected. It fought for something worth fighting for. Frank secured Rex in the makeshift harness he'd rigged, then began the slow ascent toward the circle of light above. With each foot they climbed, Frank felt more of his old self returning. The man Sarah had fallen in love with. The man who'd once believed that the world could be made better by the simple act of showing up when someone needed help. As they rose together toward the light, Frank made a promise that echoed off the stone walls of that terrible place. "I promise you this, Rex. Whoever did this to you is going to answer for it. But first, let's get you home. Let's get you back to the person who's been looking for you. Because nobody deserves to be forgotten." Frank Morrison had descended into that well as a broken, bitter man who'd given up on the world. But he was rising toward the light as someone completely different. Someone who remembered what it meant to be needed. What it meant to matter. What it meant to be the answer to someone else's prayer. And he was bringing with him a four-legged reminder that sometimes the things we think are broken beyond repair are just waiting for the right person to believe they're worth saving. Frank wrapped Rex in his old work jacket, the one Sarah had bought him for Christmas 5 years ago, the one that still held the faintest trace of her perfume in its collar. The German Shepherd was weak but alert, his intelligent brown eyes never leaving Frank's face as they made their way through the woods toward the truck. Rex trusted him completely. After everything he'd been through, after being betrayed by the very people who should have protected him, this brave dog was placing his faith in a stranger who'd climbed down into hell to bring him home. Frank understood that kind of trust. He'd felt it once, a long time ago, every time Sarah had looked at him like he could fix anything that was broken in the world. The drive to the address on Rex's collar should have taken 10 minutes. Frank made it in 6, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had gone white. Rex lay across the passenger seat, his head resting against Frank's thigh, and every few seconds Frank found himself reaching down to stroke the dog's matted fur. Just to make sure he was real. Just to make sure this wasn't some grief-induced hallucination. The house at 247, County Road 18 broke Frank's heart all over again. It was small. Modest. The kind of place a young veteran might be able to afford on disability payments and whatever savings he'd managed to scrape together. But the yard was overgrown, weeds choking what had once been flower beds. Paint was peeling from the shutters. A wheelchair ramp led to the front door, and Frank could see where someone had tried to make repairs with whatever materials they could find. This was the home of someone who was barely hanging on. Someone who'd already lost too much. Frank's hands shook as he lifted Rex from the truck. The dog was heavier than he looked, and Frank felt his back protest as he carried him up that makeshift ramp. But Rex's tail had started wagging the moment they'd turned into the driveway, and Frank realized the dog had recognized home long before Frank had found the right address. Frank knocked on the door and waited, Rex trembling with anticipation in his arms. The man who answered was younger than Frank had expected. Maybe 35, with the kind of face that should have been carefree but instead carried the weight of experiences no one that young should have had to endure. He was in a wheelchair, and Frank noticed the prosthetic leg propped against the wall behind him. But it was his eyes that Frank would remember forever. The exact moment they fell on Rex. The way they went wide with disbelief, then filled with tears that came so fast they seemed to surprise even him. Rex. The word came out as barely a whisper. That's when the dam broke. The young veteran, Marcus, Frank would learn his name was Marcus, broke down completely. Not the quiet tears of someone who's trying to maintain their dignity, but the raw, ugly sobs of someone whose heart had been ripped out and handed back to them when they'd stopped believing in miracles. "They told me he'd been hit by a car," Marcus sobbed, his hands reaching up to touch Rex's face like he was afraid the dog might disappear. "They told me he was dead. They said they'd already buried him and I believed them." Rex's response nearly undid Frank completely. The dog began whimpering and trying to climb down from Frank's arms, his tail wagging so hard his entire body shook. When Frank finally set him down, Rex immediately pressed against Marcus's legs, his head finding its familiar place on his handler's lap. The reunion was everything Frank had hoped for and nothing he was prepared for. Marcus buried his face in Rex's fur and wept like a man who'd been holding his breath for 3 weeks and could finally breathe again. "I looked everywhere for you," Marcus whispered into Rex's ear. "I called every shelter, every vet clinic, every rescue organization in 3 counties. But they said you were dead. They said you were gone." That's when the truth came tumbling out. Through tears and broken sentences, Marcus told Frank a story that made his blood boil with rage. Marcus had been in the hospital for surgery on his prosthetic, a routine procedure that had turned into a week-long stay when complications arose. His own family, his sister and her husband, had offered to watch Rex while he recovered. But caring for a disabled veteran and his service dog had proven too much trouble. Rex had been injured in the same IED blast that had cost Marcus his leg. The dog's back legs had never fully healed, and he required daily physical therapy and medication. He couldn't run like he used to. He needed help getting in and out of cars. He was, in Marcus's family's opinion, more burden than blessing. So they'd told Marcus that Rex had wandered off, that he'd been hit by a car, that there was nothing they could do but put him out of his misery. They'd even shown Marcus fake paperwork from a veterinary clinic, claiming they'd had Rex euthanized and cremated. But they hadn't killed Rex. They dumped him in that well to die slowly, where his suffering would be someone else's problem, or no one's problem at all. As Frank watched Marcus and Rex reunite, stroking the dog's fur with hands that shook with relief and joy, he realized what had really changed him forever. It wasn't just saving the dog, though that mattered more than he could have imagined when he'd first heard that crying in the woods. It was remembering what it felt like to matter to someone again, to be needed, to be the answer to someone's prayer instead of just another person walking through the world with his head down, trying not to care about anything. Frank had forgotten what it felt like to be essential, to be the difference between hope and despair, to be the reason someone could breathe again. "How can I ever thank you?" Marcus asked, his voice thick with emotion as he looked up at Frank. Frank found himself smiling for the first time in 3 years. Really smiling, not just the polite expression he wore when he had to interact with people. "You just did," Frank said simply. But that wasn't the end of their story. It was the beginning. Frank found himself visiting Marcus and Rex every few days. It started with practical things, helping with yard work that was hard to manage from a wheelchair, fixing the ramp that had been wobbling dangerously, bringing groceries when Marcus couldn't get to town. But then it became something more. Shared meals. Shared stories. 2 men who'd lost too much finding out they still had something to give each other. For the first time since Sarah died, Frank wasn't just surviving his days. He was living them, looking forward to them, planning for them. Rex recovered his strength, and Marcus bloomed under the friendship of someone who understood that broken didn't mean worthless. The 3 of them became an unlikely family, bonded by the recognition that sometimes the most damaged among us are the ones most capable of healing others. 6 months later, Frank learned that Marcus's family had been charged with animal cruelty and theft. They'd been caught when investigators traced the fake veterinary documents back to their source. Justice had been served, though Frank suspected it wouldn't bring back the weeks of torture they'd put both Marcus and Rex through. But more importantly, Frank had learned something about himself that changed everything. His greatest losses, Sarah's death, the isolation that had followed, the way grief had hollowed him out, hadn't just been meaningless suffering. They'd been preparation. Training for the moment when he'd need to recognize someone else's pain and know exactly what it looked like. Healing, Frank realized, didn't come from forgetting your wounds. It came from using them to help heal others. From letting your scars become roadmaps for people who were still lost in their own darkness. Frank Morrison had thought his story ended the day Sarah died. But that Tuesday morning in the woods, following the sound of something crying for help, he discovered something that changed everything. His story wasn't ending. It was just beginning. Today, Frank Morrison runs his farm a little differently. His morning rounds still start at dawn, boots crunching on the same gravel path he's walked for 40 years. But now there's something different in his step. Something lighter. Something that wasn't there before that Tuesday morning when he heard crying in the woods. The fence line he checks every day now includes a stop next door, where Rex greets him at the same time every morning. The German Shepherd is strong again. Healthy. His coat gleaming in the early sunlight, his tail wagging with the kind of joy that only comes from a dog who knows, absolutely knows, that he's loved and safe. Rex still limps slightly on his back legs. The scars from his old injuries will never fully fade. But he runs to that fence every morning like he's announcing to the world that broken doesn't mean defeated. Marcus helps Frank with bookkeeping now, his sharp mind making sense of decades of farm records that Frank had let slide into chaos after Sarah died. In exchange, Frank helps with repairs around Marcus's house, fixing the ramp that had been held together with hope and duct tape, painting shutters that hadn't seen a fresh coat in years, planting flowers in beds that had been choked with weeds. Two men who'd forgotten what it meant to be needed, remembering together. But the real change in Frank Morrison runs deeper than morning routines and shared labor. Frank never found out exactly who put Rex in that well. The investigation revealed that Marcus's sister and her husband had abandoned the dog there, but the deeper question, how anyone could look into Rex's trusting eyes and condemn him to such a death, remained a mystery Frank couldn't solve. But he'd learned something more important than the identity of Rex's tormentors. He'd learned that sometimes the things we think will break us are actually preparing us to save something else that's broken. Every morning when Frank hears Rex bark his greeting across the fence, that same joyful sound that had once seemed impossible when he'd first heard crying in the darkness, he's reminded of a truth that had taken him 62 years to understand. The sound of someone calling for help isn't always a burden. Sometimes, it's an invitation. An invitation to remember that we are not as alone as we think. That our pain can have purpose. That our scars can become roadmaps for people who are still lost in their own darkness. Frank's grief over Sarah hadn't disappeared. It never would. But it had transformed into something he'd never expected. The ability to recognize suffering in others. To know exactly what it looked like when someone had given up hope. To understand that sometimes the most broken among us are the ones most capable of healing each other. 3 years of isolation hadn't been wasted time. They'd been preparation. Training for the moment when he'd need to descend into someone else's hell and bring them back toward the light. Frank Morrison went into those woods that Tuesday morning because he heard crying. But he came out because he'd found something worth living for again. Not just Rex, though saving that brave dog had mattered more than Frank could have imagined. Not just Marcus, though their friendship had given Frank something he hadn't realized he'd been missing, the simple pleasure of being useful to another human being. Frank had found a reason to believe that even broken things could still save each other. That even broken people could still matter. Could still make a difference. Could still be the answer to someone's prayer. On quiet evenings, when the three of them sit together on Marcus's porch, Frank in his usual chair, Marcus in his wheelchair, Rex sprawled contentedly between them with his head resting on Frank's knee, Frank sometimes thinks about that rope in the woods. How it had been used to lower Rex into darkness, but Frank had used it to bring him back to light. How the same tool can destroy or save, depending on the hands that hold it. How the same scars that mark our deepest wounds can become the very things that allow us to heal others. The sunset paints the sky in colors Sarah would have loved, and Frank finds himself smiling at the memory instead of drowning in it. Because now he understands something she'd tried to tell him in those final moments, something he'd been too frightened to hear. Love doesn't end when someone dies. It transforms. It finds new ways to express itself. New people to help. New hearts to heal. Rex lifts his head and looks at Frank with those intelligent brown eyes, And Frank sees something there that takes his breath away. Not just gratitude, though that's there too, but recognition. The acknowledgement that passes between two souls who've both been abandoned, both been forgotten, both been written off as worthless, and who've discovered that sometimes the most broken among us are exactly the ones the world needs most. What sounds of need are you hearing in your own life? What opportunities to make a difference are you walking past every day? Sometimes, the thing that changes us forever, the thing that transforms our deepest pain into our greatest purpose, is simply choosing to answer when someone calls for help. Even when that call comes from the darkest places. Even when answering means climbing down into hell to bring someone back to the light. Because that's when we discover that we are not just saving them. They're saving us right back.